Good afternoon, YouTubers. I hope everybody's staying safe and trying to stay warm depending on where you're at. It's cold here in Pennsylvania today. Wind's a little bit up and it's getting chilly, so we're approaching winter time, so I suppose all in all that's a good thing. Today's topic is about Pearl Harbor, and I want to tell a story about Pearl Harbor, but I'm not going to tell a story about the attack on Pearl Harbor itself, but I'm going to tell you a story that how my late father remembered the attack on Pearl Harbor and how it impacted his life. So I'm just going to share a story about that. Now, he told me quite a few stories over the years about Pearl Harbor and how he remembered it. But for the intents and purposes of this vlog today, I am going to tell you one that I remember the most. So this was an early Sunday morning, December 7th, 1941. The Japanese had bombed Pearl Harbor very early in the morning. News of that didn't quite spread yet. It wasn't exactly known instantaneously as it happened. It certainly wasn't Hawaii, but it wasn't for the rest of the continental United States. It took a few hours. And my father was sent to the store by my grandmother, excuse me, my late grandmother. And she said, look, I got a list here. I want you to go to the store and pick up these things. We got to have stuff for Sunday dinner. So you go down there and you get this stuff. So my father had a buddy with him. His name was Tommy Yanisek. That was my dad's best man at his wedding. Tommy would go off to fight in World War II as well. In fact, he would be on a battleship, and he would fight kamikazes coming into his ship. And boy, he had some stories. I'm kind of getting off track here, but so anyways, they're down there at the store, and you know, they come marching back up. My father lived on 6th Avenue in Plan 11 area there, and they come up, and he could hear people shouting outside their homes, talking to each other. I can't believe what happened. I can't believe this. Can you believe that they bombed the whole place? And my father was like, what the hell is he talking about? What are all these people screaming and yelling about? What's going on? What, you know? And him and his buddy, they're looking confused. They're looking at each other going, I don't know what's going on. So they keep going. They keep marching back up. They'll go up and they get back to the 6th Avenue there. My father's house. That's where he lived. That's where he was born. That's where he lived when he grew up. 6th Avenue, Aliquippa. So he gets into the house, and my grandmother's standing there literally with tears in her eyes, and she said, you can't believe what happened. You didn't hear it, did you? My father's like, no, but I see everybody outside making a fuss over something. And she said, the Japanese have bombed a harbor in Hawaii. And my father and his best friend looked at each other like, oh my God. Now you got to remember, this was a time before TVs. This was a time when radios were a big part of even Beaver County's community, let alone the United States. So they all went in and around in the living room, and my grandfather turned on the radio. Well, he already had it on, actually. And they were sitting there all looking at each other and listening to everything that was going on, all the bulletins that were coming in, attempting to make sense of this bombardment, this craziness that nobody would even conceive or let alone have the ability to prepare for. And they had figured out eventually that the Japanese had bombed a harbor in Hawaii called Pearl Harbor. Thousands of servicemen had been killed. Dozens of battleships had been blown to bits. And on 6th Avenue, my grandmother went outside attempting to compose herself. And it was then that she realized that there were a lot of other mothers out in the street, and they were all crying and hugging each other. And of course, my grandmother joined in. And my father stood there on the porch looking at my grandmother and all the other mothers on 6th Avenue, all holding hands and all crying. They knew war was coming. They knew that a lot of their sons were going to go into the Army, going to get drafted. Army, Navy, Air Force, Air Corps, Marines, whatever. They all knew what was happening. They all knew what this foretold. Aliquippa was in complete turmoil, my dad said. Everybody was scared. Everybody was uncertain. The imaginations were flaring. Everybody was thinking about the worst possible outcome. And you got to remember, as I stressed already, this was a time before televisions. People were gathering around radios and they read newspapers to accrue news. And a large part of that was using your imagination, something we don't do anymore because social media has replaced everything. How we think, how we feel, and how we imagine things. Wasn't like that in my father's time. And all the ladies were just inconsolable at times, my father said. The husbands would have to come out and bring the ladies back into the house. That's how bad it got. He told me the story, you know, and when he used to tell me this, and I'm thinking to myself, man, you know, that must have been really, really bad. Well, fast forward a little bit, 1941 to 1945, my grandmother would write letters to my father and his older brother, who was also in the war, but he fought in Europe. My father fought in Japan, telling both of them that the ladies on the street would hold their breath because they would always see that man coming up in a uniform and telling so-and-so, I'm sorry, but, you know, your boy's dead. You know, he was killed in the line of duty, sacrificing for his country. And I can't tell you the negative impact that had along the corridors and not only in Aliquippa, but the entire Beaver County. It was just devastating. A lot of the ladies in Beaver County, the mothers, lived in fear, knowing that, you know, their sons were overseas, and at any moment they could get that dreadful visitor coming up to their steps, having to tell them that your son is no longer. I want you to try and wrap your head around that for a moment. Especially you younger folks who don't know much about, you know, Pearl Harbor, or, you know, you don't know much about Beaver County's contribution to World War II. And this is why I tell this story, because I didn't want to tell it from the American history perspective. I wanted to tell it from the local history paradigm, because eventually what was to come was that most of the men from Beaver County, not just Aliquippa, but from the entire Beaver County, would fight in all the major battles of World War II, all with the exception, I suppose, of the Eastern Campaign between the Russians and Germans, because we didn't fight the war on the Eastern Front. But he would fight in the Battle of the Bulge, you know, Okinawa, Tarawa, Iwo Jima. My father had friends. Fast forward in this video a little bit. My father had friends that died in Iwo Jima. He had friends that survived Iwo Jima. He had friends that were in Okinawa. He had friends that were in Saipan. He had friends at Guadalcanal. He had friends at the Battle of the Bulge. The list goes on. My father would witness the bombing of Hiroshima at the ripe old age of 18. He was a little bit younger than his older brother Andy. Uncle Andy would survive the siege of Bastogne. So the impact that this had on my dad was anything but extraordinary. And years later, as he got married to my mother, and, you know, us kids came along, you know, and I want the younger people in Aliquippa to understand this, because you don't have it no more. So I'm going to say this, and I want the older folks here that subscribe to my channel, especially if you're from Aliquippa, I want you to comment below, if you will, and always remind the younger folks, who remembers every Memorial Day that there used to be in Aliquippa in Plan 12, at the Plan 12 War Memorial there, across from the ball fields and where Plan 12 pool used to be. They used to have a memorial there every Memorial Day for the soldiers. Who remembers that? My father would take me there religiously every Memorial Day. We never missed it. Then we would go home and he would light the grill, charcoal grill in those days. And he always told me, he said, I don't want you to emulate our soldiers, but he said, I always want you to never forget. And whenever we would talk about wars and battles, and he would tell me things about his brother and tell me things about his friends, I said, geez, Dad, you know, what heroes you guys are. And one time I said that to him, and he looked at me and he said, I'm going to tell you something. And he said, I don't want you to take this the wrong way, but he said, I'm not a hero. Your uncle's not a hero. None of your uncles who served in the other wars, because I have uncles that served in Korea and Vietnam in later years. He said, none of us are heroes. He said, the real heroes are the ones that never came home. And as you remember this today, and as you remember this video, I want you to understand, and I want you to appreciate what I'm trying to tell you here, how lucky we are to live in a country like this. And today, if you have the time, go to a cemetery. Go to a cemetery here in Beaver County and go look at a grave of a veteran and tell them thank you, especially the ones who have died in combat. Because every cemetery in Beaver County here has KIAs, every one of them. You just have to look for them. So anyways, guys, that's the one story that I have. I have many stories that my father told me. I actually thought about writing a book about this, but in a future video, I'm going to tell you about his time in Hiroshima and how that impacted his life and how it affected him raising a family. If you want to hear about that, comment below, like, subscribe. I hope that this video is beneficial to you. I hope you enjoyed the story. And let us remember today the significance of this and how it transformed America, how it forever transformed America. And let us never forget any of our veterans, okay? Let's look at a veteran today, even if you have one on your street today. Go over there and shake his hand and tell him thank you. Thank you. Thank you for listening.